The Lotus 72 was an iconic Formula One car. Apart from being a very good-looking racing car as well, it was a tremendously successful one, racing from a period of 1970 to 1975 and winning 2 World Drivers' Championships during that period. The Lotus 72 contested 74 Grand Prix and won 20 of those, which is an amazing win rate, 27% of races that it won. It also scored about 16 pole positions, so it was a quick car as well as being one that got to the finish of races. There are 3 drivers closely associated with the Lotus 72, and all 3 of those won Grand Prix and 2 of them won World Championships with the car. These are Jochen Rindt, Emerson Fittipaldi and Ronnie Peterson. Jochen Rindt was the driver who really developed the Lotus 72 into a winning force, and he in fact won 4 consecutive Grand Prix, which formed the basis of his title-winning effort in 1970. The secret to the success of the Lotus 72 was the fact that it never stood still. It evolved all the time through that period, 1970 to 75, constant evolution. In fact, the car wasn't very successful when it was introduced, and the team had to go literally back to the drawing board to make it work. And in the first few appearances for the car, the team's lead driver, Jochen Rindt, was so disillusioned with the way that it performed that he actually reverted back to the Lotus 49 to drive.
But the whole idea of the car was twofold, was to make the suspension extremely light to minimise the unsprung weight, and that was why the brakes came inboard. And because of the rising rate suspension concept, a lot of people used to think, oh, this can't be right, but we actually used to let the car crash on the ground because the suspension was so light that if it crashed to the bottom of the suspension, it would break the suspension. So the car actually had proper skid blocks built in right from day one. And when it bottomed on the chassis and not bottomed out on the suspension. Because the original concept also was that it had no bump rubbers, because it was a rising rate that got steeper and steeper and steeper.
I think it was a new concept with the wedge shape, the inboard brakes, even the torsion bar suspension that was difficult to adjust, but when you got the torsion bar working well, was just so consistent from track to track in 72 and 73. Was a car that I could talk to him and to talk to me. We understand each other very well. Yeah. I just, after 2 or 3 corners, I knew exactly what the car was doing, and I could tell Colin, and immediately Colin could react, change the car, and another improvement, and it was a magic car to drive. I love it.
The point about the 72 is that it embodied so many technical innovations. When you think about it, it had inboard brakes, it had side radiators, it had this kind of new aerodynamic shape, it had rising rate suspension, it had these very, very exaggerated suspension angles in side view, giving you a lot of anti-dive and anti-squat. There was this mass of innovation which one had to try and pick through to understand why the car was not very good.
The anti-squat and anti-dive went out almost immediately. I mean, I don't think, again, a lot of people realise what a complete disaster the car was when it was first launched. And this was part of the concept of keeping the aerodynamic platform stable and making it not pitch sensitive, So there was anti-dive on the front suspension to stop the nose going down and anti-squat on the rear to stop the rear squatting. But actually what we found was that as the car went into a corner, after it had performed those functions, then there was a jacking component in the suspension which jacked the inside of the car up because of the angles of the wishbones front and rear. And so that was abandoned, but of course, again, not a lot of people were aware of how dramatic a decision that was, because the front frame of the Lotus 72, which carried the brake discs and the wishbones and the pedal foot box, there was as much work in that tubular structure as there was in a complete chassis before then. And that bit was just the front bit that then went onto the monocoque. And the monocoque was a double curvature skin monocoque, which was incredibly complex to make. And so the whole thing was dramatic when somebody said, there's no alternative, we've got to change it all.
In Colin's mind, the principles he'd built into the suspension regarding anti-dive and anti-squat should have worked. His objective was obviously to make a car which, in the heave mode, so up and down, when the whole body moves up and down, was very well controlled through the rising rate, and in the pitch mode, braking and accelerating, it was also extremely well controlled, in fact didn't pitch. Thus improving the aerodynamics, as they do now in modern Formula One, and making the car go quicker. Unfortunately, it didn't work out like that. We had a lot of failures that were reported, but there were failures that weren't reported. Obviously, I had a wheel fall off at Spa. Jochen had a monocoque bend when he spun at Zandvoort and didn't hit anything. He just spun, and one of the radius arm pickups bent. I think he had some various failures. Things would crack, and the crack would be seen in time around the rear end of the car. There were my brake shaft failure in Austria was another, in a sense, mechanical issue. So there were kind of continual updates going on, continual modifications to up-spec things that failed or nearly failed.
The story of the Lotus 72 was one of tremendous highs and tremendous lows. The biggest low was the death of Jochen Rindt in 1970. Jochen had joined Team Lotus in 1969 and had immediately been faster than the established driver, Graham Hill. He'd been very quick, but again, a bit like Ronnie Peterson later on, unable to win Grand Prix. However, in 1969 he did finally manage to win the US Grand Prix in Watkins Glen, and he was widely recognised as being one of the fastest drivers on the Grand Prix circuit, along with Jackie Stewart.
The first thing I would say is that we should not really have been in a position where we were chancing our arm to the extent we were by just removing wings at a circuit, at a race meeting, finding the car was unstable, because even Jochen agreed that the car was highly nervous or interesting to drive without wings. We should have been in a position where we sort of understood what we were doing, because there was certainly no wind tunnel work done with no wings on the car, because the car was designed to have wings. So that's the first point. The second point is, yes, of course, the wings made the car less stable, therefore less controllable at high speed, therefore any event that would cause the car to be destabilised would be made more difficult to control or impossible to control by the aerodynamics.
It was difficult, but I think we knew that could be the drive shaft. The drive shaft has been changed. And I feel much more confidence on the car driving. Was tremendous pressure on me, being the suddenly #1 driver from Team Lotus after only my 4th Grand Prix, no experience. I had this tremendous pressure that I had to do well. I was not thinking about the mechanical failure because that was solved. I was thinking how I'm going to do with being #1 driver for Lotus.
Jochen was difficult to read. He lived, as did most of the Formula One entourage, in a different world, in a stratified world. He lived in, amongst the Stewarts and the very high profile. Obviously Piers had been killed, but that's one of his best friends. He lived in that sort of rather fast world. The day that Peter Wall rang me to say I'd been replaced by Rayner was a black day for me. But underneath it all, when you look back at these things, I think Colin's decision was probably the right one, actually. And in the event, I carried on racing and did some quite good things. And it pushed me into a new path in life, which would have only been delayed had I not left Lotus.
In '71 it didn't have a fair test because Emerson had his road crash halfway through the season and broke his sternum, and he was in some considerable pain and out of the car for quite a lot of the season. Wissel could have won in Holland, but he was a very moody driver, and he got up on race morning, it was raining, and he was fourth on the grid on the right tyres, and the three cars in front of him were on Goodyears, and he was on Firestones where the wets were miles better. And it just psyched him completely that it was raining. And in the race he pulled past the pit and reversed up the pit road and got himself disqualified when he could have won the race. And in '72 it all came good because Emerson had a car which was really performing so beautifully, it was unbelievable. The fact of the matter is that in 1970 we had £112,000 sponsorship from John Player and Sons. And, that sounds like petty cash nowadays. Steve Hallam of McLaren was telling me not long ago that it costs them £100,000 to send one man on the race crew to every race during the year, and I think they take 60 or 70 to a race meeting. Well, our total and the last 12,500 of that players' sponsorship was because we undertook an extra category for them, which was the little Lotus 47 GT car. So money was tight. We had a contract with Firestone, we had a bit of money off Shell, we had bonuses from the usual people, but there was never a great sort of surplus of money swishing about. And the biggest change was that we had the DFV free in '67, '68, and part of '69, '70 we had to pay for it. So all of a sudden there was a huge on-cost, and if you think that a DFV at that era cost £7,500 and a rebuild, a real rebuild, a big rebuild was about £5,000, that soon eats up your 112 grand sponsorship. So we needed Alex Solar-Roy, just amongst other things, to generate funds for the team. It wasn't specifically to pay for this program or that program. And in '72 it all came good because Emerson had a car which was really performing so beautifully, it was unbelievable. But it also had a big advantage over the rest of the field.
It was for the first time I had the transition from trade tires for slicks. And I think there was a much more grip generated by the tires, and the suspension start deflecting, and some tracks were reasonably quick, other tracks we lost performance, we couldn't adjust the car, just everything was moving. Then Maurice Philippe designed a new suspension through the year that we try in Brands Hatch in October, a non-championship race when Seifert got killed. And that weekend was the first time since the beginning of the season that I feel was going to be a very good car for 1972. I feel it was a consistent car to drive, to test, to develop. Everything was solid again, was not moving. And I was looking for the 1972 season.
We wanted to test the market without giving the game away, and Colin couldn't or didn't want to go back to Monza. in 71, and we didn't want to take the 72s there in case they got nicked by the Italians. So we entered the turbine car for Emerson under the entrance license of Worldwide Racing, and it was painted gold and black, and that was the test case to see how people might react to a Lotus that was a different colour to green and yellow, or red, white and gold as they had been in the John Player thing. And it caused quite a bit of fuss, and there was quite a bit of analysis of the photographs to see you know, how it might shape up. And that was the first step down the John Player Special route.
And when Colin told me that the car was going to be black, I said, black? A Grand Prix car? I said, no way, Colin. Black with gold stripes? I was scared to look at the car, but it was, I think it's one of the most beautiful racing cars ever built. I mean, beautiful on the color, beautiful in the design, and it was, so far was the best race car I ever drove in my career. It was an incredible car to drive.
And then, of course, the other thing, which unfortunately there are very, very few people in this world who have experienced it, and I'm very happy to say that I'm one of them, and that is that if you had been driving racing cars of the period, they were, you know, quite rough, bouncy, bangy, you know, everything going. The 72 had a Rolls-Royce ride. I mean, it was like Jochen said it was like a limo. You know, it was like driving a limo because the suspension was so compliant and everything worked so beautifully. It was just fantastic.
For sure, it was very important, and Colin was the best school I could have had. I mean, he was a master, a genius of getting the car right. I mean, he was the best engineer I ever worked in a racing car. He had this intuition to get the car working, and perception. I just few words to Colin, he knew exactly what I have to do to the car, and he would change the car was going to be faster. And I had a big smile on my face again. It was good from the beginning of the season, but we had a very good basic setup on the car. We were trying different things through the season, but not too much. It was more adjusting the car to each different track, like final tuning, you know, tire pressures, a little bit of camber, spring, dampers, but not major changes on the car.
We adopted what was and what would now be totally and universally accepted as the Ron Dennis policy of equal number ones, and you go out there and you sort yourselves out. And everyone mistrusted Lotus's ability to produce two equal cars and two equal deals for the two drivers, which, as Ron is forever saying in current interviews, absolutely not true. What possible incentive is there for a team to not provide the best car you can? The whole idea of having two good drivers or two equal number ones is that certainly in that era you couldn't rely on reliability. And if one car dropped out, you had to have a chance of winning the race with the other. Well, if you had a number two driver, he wasn't going to win for you. So you had a situation where they're both the same.
We did a lot of testing, but immediately the car was much more understeer. I remember Interlagos was the first Goodyear test, and immediately I had to put much more front wing, try to improve the front end of the car to compensate the balance, and was, you know, after the Argentina Grand Prix, the car was really well balanced, well trimmed. It took us 2 Grand Prix, even though we won both Grand Prix, but took few races to get the Goodyear working as good as Firestone was working before.
In fact, in 1972, I did the whole Formula One season. I think we did 6 non-championship races as well, and all the testing. That's why I miss my kids growing up.
Ronnie Peterson joined the team for 1973, and straight away he proved himself to be as fast as, if not faster than, Emerson Fittipaldi. The problem was he was quite hard on his car, and although he led a lot of races in the first part of the season, it wasn't actually until the French Grand Prix in July, midway through the season, that he scored his first victory. After that, the wins came fast. He won in Austria, he won in Italy, and also in the United States, and really probably would have won the World Championship that year if it hadn't have been for the poor reliability at the beginning of the season.
In 73, you will never ever see again, as long as you live, the sight of Ronnie coming round the Curva de Sol at Interlagos with smoke coming off both rear tyres. But equally, you won't hear Emerson, who came in at Silverstone before they had the chicane. He said, "You give me a little more wing, I take it flat." You know, woodcut, flat, hang on a minute, chap, you know. Ronnie would go round and round and round and be slower. And then 15 minutes before the end of practice, he'd say, "Oh shit, well, put Emerson's settings on the car." And we put Emerson's settings on the car, and he'd go out and be half a second quicker than Emerson, which didn't do a lot for Emerson's morale, of course. But Ronnie always believed that he could set up a car. What Ronnie didn't realise was that he was so good, he could drive round any problem almost immediately and compensate for what the car wasn't doing. And then he'd come in and he'd tell you something and it was patently not right because, you know, that isn't the way things are. I mean, the classic one for me with Ronnie was we were testing at Ricard before they changed any of the circuit. Again, the Mistral straight there was 1.25 kilometres long, and at the end of it was Scene Corner, which is one of the most terrifying corners in the whole of motor racing. And Ronnie was coming into the pits and saying, no, 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 the car's understeering, the car's terrible understeer. And I'd say, Ronnie, look, I'm sorry, I don't think this is right. I think, you know, the tyre temperatures on the front are cool and the rears are almost overheated. That's a sign the rear is sliding to. No, 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 it's understeering, he said, it's understeering. So I actually got in the car, her car, and I drove round the outside of the circuit to where the Matra factory was and watched from the outside of Scene. And guess what? The car was understeering, but in order to compensate, Ronnie was throwing it sideways at 160 miles an hour into one of the wildest corners there was in motor racing in order to get around the corner. And, you know, practically setting the rear tyres on fire. So he was right, but he was driving around a problem which was giving us wrong data in the pits. We were saying, no, no, come on, Ronnie, this is oversteer.
We had failures on the wheel. And I remember I had a huge crash, took away all the points I could have in Zandvoort. And then Nürburgring, I was, you know, struggling to finish 5th or 6th, I finished. I had my feet very solo. I had to have local anesthesia to drive the car. Yes, the wheel, I would say, damaged the results of the championship. I don't know if I could win, but it took better chance to win.
Emerson was already, by the end of 73, the much more cautious race driver. He'd seen a lot. He'd seen a lot of accidents, a lot of harm, a lot of damage, and he didn't want the same thing to happen to him. And he used his head an awful lot. And he was a guy like Stewart or Prost. He could be 8th on the grid, but you could never discount him in a race. Even at McLaren, he was never up the front of the grid. He was always 6th, 7th, but he was always there at the finish. And Ronnie was just balls to the wall, flat out all the time, wasn't happy unless he was the fastest on every occasion, whether it was testing, demonstrating, racing, whatever. And so there was inevitably going to be a conflict. And then Ronnie, I think he had 11 pole positions in the season, so that's sort of like out-driving the other bloke in the team. And they finished up, was it 4-3 victories, 4 and 3? So, and Emerson made the decision quite early on that he was going to go to McLaren, and we knew that, although he hadn't told us, we had heard about it through the grapevine.
It was the best racing car I ever drove, not just Formula One, including all the Indy cars, sports car, everything I drove. To me, that was the best.